Good morning, everybody. So glad you've joined me for today's devotion. We are in the 10th chapter of the book of Isaiah in your Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 10. And before I get to what spoke to me and what I want to apply to us, I just want to give you an overview of this chapter to help you understand it as you read it and study it. In this chapter, God, through the prophet Isaiah, makes it clear that the Assyrian nation, the Assyrian Empire army, was God's instrument for judging the northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria, and that happened in 722 BC. In verses 5 and 6, woe to Assyria, and we'll come back to that in a minute, but notice that Assyria was the rod of my anger, the rod of God's anger, and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation, and that's the northern kingdom of Samaria, as he describes in the opening verses of chapter 10. Commission it against the people of my fury, to capture booty and to seize plunder and to trample them down like mud in the streets. Wow. So God says Assyria's basically total destruction of the northern kingdom of Samaria or Israel. Assyria was God's instrument he used to punish severely the northern kingdom. That's one of the things Isaiah makes clear in this chapter. Number two, second thing Isaiah makes clear in this chapter is that through him, God looks forward into the future. Beyond simply the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, he looks into the future to the destruction, the judgment of the southern kingdom of Judah and her capital, Jerusalem, which happened in 587 BC. Now think about that. 722 BC in the north, 587 BC in the south. What is that? 135 years later. So God looks over a century into the future, if you will, to the destruction or the fall of the southern kingdom, which happened at the hand of the Babylonians. Look at verse 11. Verse 11. Shall I not do to Jerusalem and her images just as I have done to Samaria and her idols? Wow. The Babylonians burned the city of Jerusalem to the ground, destroyed the temple of God, carried away the Ark of the Covenant. If they didn't melt it down for gold, we don't really know. And deported large portions of the population, the majority of the population, over 3 different deportations as slaves to Babylon. And so that's part of what Isaiah is talking about, the prophetic nature of this particular chapter. He also, in this chapter, talks about the remnant that would return. After they had been in Babylon a number of years, and then Persia captured Babylon, and Cyrus, Persia's king, allowed the Jews to return, and most of them stayed in Babylon, but a remnant would later return and rebuild the city of Jerusalem, the wall and the temple. That's Nehemiah and all of that. He talks about that in verses 21 and 22. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant within them will return. See, the majority of the Jews never made it back. The vast majority of their descendants never made it back to the promised land. It was only a small percentage of them from which God rebuilt the nation. So all of that is referred to in chapter 10. And then a fourth message in chapter 10 is that even though, as we saw yesterday, Assyria was the instrument God used to judge the northern kingdom, once God was finished punishing Israel, the northern kingdom, Samaria, with Assyria, God was then going to turn around and judge and punish Assyria. Look at verse 12. Verse 12. And so it will be that when the Lord has completed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the pomp of his haughtiness. Now, He destroyed Assyria with Babylon, and then later Babylon with Persia. Did exactly what he said. And the reason was because of their arrogance. He goes on in verses 13 and following to talk about how they thought all of their conquest was because they were so great and so wise and so powerful, and didn't realize that their rise to power and their power to conquer was actually something God was doing. He talks about that over a little bit more over in verses 24 and 25 when he says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not fear the Assyrian who strikes you with the rod and lifts up his staff against you the way Egypt did," going back centuries before. "For in a very little while my indignation against you will be spent, judgment will be finished, and my anger will be directed to their destruction." That's a lot. There's a lot in this chapter. And one of the lessons for you and me is that God is always at work among the nations, even when we don't know it, don't see it. That God moves here and God moves there, and sometimes God even uses evil people, evil nations. And we don't always realize in the moment what God is actually doing. And so God judged Assyria in this chapter for her arrogance. Why did God judge Samaria and later Jerusalem and Judea? Well, we've already seen in Kings in previous readings earlier this year and other passages, their idolatry and their unfaithfulness to God. Yes, that's a major reason he judged them. But in chapter 10, Isaiah also mentions another reason, the same reason that Amos, whom we read some time ago, that Amos and Hosea, but in particular Amos mentioned. Look in Isaiah chapter 10, look at the opening verses. "Woe to those who enact evil statutes, and to those who constantly record unjust decisions," bad laws, bad court decisions. Why are they bad? Verse 2, "Because they deprive the needy of justice and rob the poor of my people of their rights, and that widows may be their spoil, and that they may plunder the orphans." Verse 3, "Now what will you do in the day of punishment and in the devastation which will come from afar," referring to Assyria, another country coming over. "To whom will you flee for help?" There's nowhere to go. When God judges, there's nowhere to go. Nobody can rescue you. "And where will you leave your wealth?" The Old Testament prophets make it clear that God judged his nations, the nation of Israel and the nation of Samaria and the nation of Judah, for their immorality, their sexual impurity, for their idolatry, their unfaithfulness to God. But these prophets again and again make it clear that God judged them for a lack of justice in the court system and in their economy. You can do with that what you want, but God's prophets make it clear that God cares about how a nation treats those who are its weakest, most vulnerable citizens. You can't read the prophets of God and not see that, unless you just read it with your eyes closed. So many lessons. God works in this world in ways we don't understand. God works through nations we don't realize he's working through them, and sometimes he uses evil people and evil nations to even judge his own people. And the reason God judges us can be for a lot of different reasons, so we need to be careful Just because God is using someone doesn't mean they are His man or woman. They just may be a wicked person that's His instrument. And the truth is, He might be using them not to save us, but to judge us. Through everything, fear God. Fear no man. Through everything, trust in God. And don't ever put your trust in anyone but Him. You might just find yourself on the wrong side of what God is doing if you don't keep your fear and your trust directed toward God and never toward man. Let God be our sanctuary. Trust Him. God may, do you know that God may just be judging America and giving us what we deserve in this day and age. Fear God. Fear God. And don't you dare put your fear, your trust, anyone else. That's the message from Isaiah. Tomorrow we'll be in our reading plan in Isaiah chapter 42. See you then.